Test, test, prova, prova. Va bene? Okay, great. I'm glad we fixed that. Thank you, Simon, very much for the invitation to me to come back after many decades to the British Institute, where in fact, in a sense, the British Institute was where my love of Florence and Florentine history began. So I think it's very appropriate that I should talk about my latest book. Now, the main focus of this talk is plague in Florence, as you gather from the title, a topic made famous by Giovanni Boccaccio's detailed description of the impact of the plague and the Black Death in particular on the city in Florence in 1348, and I'll quote, "I say then that the sum of 1348 years had elapsed since the fruitful incarnation of the Son of God, when the noble city of Florence, which for its great beauty exceeds all others in Italy, was visited by the deadly pestilence. In the face of its advance, all the wisdom and ingenuity of man was no avail, nor were the countless petitions humbly directed to God by the pious, whether by means of formal processions or in any other guise, were they any more effective." Now, this account has become part of the collective memory of late medieval plague, and despite its literary nature, it did broadly reflect some of the secular and spiritual strategies adopted by Florence, which were developed further, as we'll see, over the coming centuries to become the basis of the city's public health system. The introduction by Boccaccio has retained an iconic status, comparable to the much later and much longer accounts of Alessandro Manzoni in I Promessi Sposi and Daniel Defoe on London. This talk will concentrate principally on the 17th century, and like Boccaccio, Manzoni, and Defoe, I want to concentrate on one city in 1 year, Florence in 1630-1, which was the last time that the plague epidemic affected Florence, and is also the subject of the book, which I published in 2019, just before COVID, in which for the first time in my life led to an extraordinary interest by the general public and journalists in my work. For that, I was totally obscure, and I'm sure I shall remain so again. It came out in 2019, and then it came out in Italian. I'm sorry, I don't have a copy here, but I'm sure you could go on Amazon if you all want to buy a copy. Plague has remained relevant through the centuries as each age has faced the challenge of new epidemic diseases, from cholera, tuberculosis, to AIDS, SARS, bird flu, and of course, COVID. But plague remains a paradigm against which reactions to other epidemics have been judged. Plague is often seen as providing a template for public health measures, and some of the main strategies developed in Italy in the Renaissance and the early modern periods, such as isolation and quarantine, are in fact seen as models for later public health policies, as we'll see, as we've seen with COVID. However, there's a note of caution. We should remember that although one can compare past and present epidemics, the different levels of mortality were enormous. So up to 50% of Florence, the Florentine population died in 1348-9, with clearly there was a much lower rate of mortality during COVID. Now, introducing my subject, let's discuss what contemporaries thought caused plague and how that informed their reactions and policies. You may have met this gentleman before, particularly if you've been to Venice during Carnivale. His personal protection equipment includes his famous beak, which contained herbs and spices to filter and purify the air. There was a glass lens to cover his eyes, and a leather mask protects his face, which was designed to prevent the inhalation or the absorption of the corrupt vapors of plague. Because plague was seen as infected air, essentially. It was certainly not seen as we would today, the association with rats and fleas. And it was seen as created by the release of vapors, corrupt air from, for example, the earth when there were earthquakes, or from, as well, from rotting sort of animal bodies or rotting refuse and so on. And the idea was that it created these miasmae, or these corrupt air, which then infected the air and people breathed it in. And it was spread from place to place by winds. So the problem then, of course, arises if one of these winds containing the infected seeds, as they call them, of plague, arrived over the city of Florence, why didn't 100% of the population die? And the answer was that some people were more susceptible, as they were, to COVID, and other people were less. But anyhow, as I said, it led to, at least in Florence, in the Black Death, to a 50% mortality rate. But just as we shouldn't forget that at the time there was no understanding of what we think caused bubonic plague, the bite of an infected rat flea, so we must remember that for contemporaries, religion played a central strategy in the fight against plague, reflecting belief in the necessity to placate divine ire. Plague was seen as God's punishment for the sins of mankind through prayers, and were placated through prayers and public masses. Elaborate processions with holy relics were an integral part of the ceremonial response to the disease. The church and the city harnessed the power of the role of major plague saints, such as Saint Sebastian. Here we see the image of Giovanni del Biondo, Saint Sebastian, about 1375 in the Opera del Duomo. And also the other main plague saint was Saint Rocco, you'll know the famous Scuola di San Rocco. And the difference between pincushion, which all these arrows are piercing him. The arrows obviously was the way that he suffered from his first martyrdom, but also it was a way of representing the way that plague was spread through the air. So that the darts or the arrows of plague represent the poison arrows of the disease. On the right-hand side, you've got Saint Roch, or San Rocco, who is always shown pointing to a bubo on his thigh. And that obviously, as you know, is one of the reasons it's called bubonic plague, that was one of the main signs of plague at the time. There are also other powerful saints, and often local saints, were also invoked, as in the 15th century, Archbishop of Florence, Saint Antoninus. Now here's a fresco in the Chiostro di Sant'Antonino in San Marco from a much later period, from 1693, but it shows the life of Saint Antoninus, and this was one of the scenes from the life, which shows Saint Antoninus visiting the plague victims and giving them extreme unction and comforting them while they were dying. So it's part of his legend that made him so famous. We'll come back to Saint Antoninus later. I will, though, this evening be concentrating more on secular responses to plague, although we can obviously talk more about religious ones in the discussion, although religion and the church remains an important underlying theme. I want to divide up the talk according to three recent categories with which you'll all be familiar, and which we saw as typifying the strategies which were adopted by governments across the world as the COVID epidemic unfolded. You remember the three words that kept being repeated: containment, mitigation, and quarantine. And this will demonstrate that many of the policies that we've seen recently followed the example of Renaissance and early modern Italian states. I'll also, after looking at the strategies adopted by governments, also look at their impact on people living in their own houses, people at home, people in streets who actually broke sanitary legislation. And again, through these extraordinarily detailed court records, we can get a very good idea of individuals' reactions, which parallel, in fact, I've discovered many of the ones over the last few years during COVID. So first of all, let's begin with containment. A major aim of containment was obviously to prevent the epidemic arriving in a country or a state by banning trade with infected regions and the establishment of cordons sanitaires. The placing of mounted guards along frontiers was aimed to prevent infected people entering their territories, even though in practice these barriers often proved quite porous, and the authorities and people were passed through, sort of, if you like, between the mounted guards. So let's just have a look at these two major epidemics of plague in the 17th century. These are the last two epidemics of plague to hit Italy. The first one was in 1629 to 31, and the second one is in 1652 to 7. And just to give you some idea of the mortality levels from the first one, as you can see on the right-hand side, in Milan, 46% of a population of 130,000 died. Venice, 33%. Verona lost 61%, so even higher than the Black Death. But then is what's interesting, as the plague travels further south, so it arrives in Bologna and then in Florence, the mortality begins to diminish. So in Bologna, 24%, and in Florence, only, in inverted commas, 12% of the population died. It was introduced by both the imperial and also the French armies invading northern Italy during one of the last phases of the 30 Years' War. And if you look at the right-hand map, you can see the two squares, one in the north and one in the northwest. Those were where the first cases were discovered. And then the dots represent the spread of plague through the rest of Italy, through the rest of northern and central Italy in 1629 to 31. Now, if you compare that with the plague in Italy in 1652 to 7, you'll see there's a very different geographical spread of the disease. In the first one, the plague was confined to northern and central Italy. In the second epidemic, it was almost confined entirely to southern Italy, from Rome south and also Sardinia. And then it actually broke out briefly in Genoa as well. So the question is then, what explains this strange difference between the two epidemics, that impact the two epidemics? And I was working years ago when I was at the European University with Carlo Cipolla, and he knew I was going to be working on this subject. And he said, well, John, what is the explanation for this? And he couldn't answer. And if he couldn't answer, then I haven't been able to either. However, having said that, I think that part of the explanation, which historians have sort of come to conclusions subsequently, is the fact that the cordon sanitaire actually worked. So in other words, the distribution of the soldiers across frontiers actually stopped the plague arriving in further south from Florence in the early epidemic, and didn't spread north in the subsequent epidemic. Anyhow, that is the first element of containment. So let's now turn to look at Florence's experience of plague in 1631. The center of this talk, and also the center of my book, where the first cases were recorded on the outskirts of Florence in, as you probably know, Trespiano, where there is the vast cemetery. So that was where the first epidemic broke out. The finger of blame was pointed at a chicken dealer, see a gentleman on the right, who had the misfortune to travel towards Bologna to sell his fowl at the beginning of the epidemic. After being refused entry to Florence, he fled to Trespiano, persuaded an innkeeper to also became infected, and his symptoms developed on his return home when he went to the city centre. Now, this story can be repeated over and over again in any or epidemics. There is, if you like, everybody looks for patient zero, whether it's in the past or whether it's the present. And certain sectors of society were normally blamed for the start of the epidemic, and indeed its diffusion later on. And they're often beggars and foreigners, anybody who was from outside the city. It wasn't long before the disease spread to the city itself, and the period of worst mortality, which you can see on the left-hand side, was in the autumn, and then it gradually diminished over the spring. So let's move then to the second phase of the plague epidemic measures, which is mitigation. First of all, I think a remarkable thing in this period is that city-states in Italy established health boards, Magistrato di Sanità, who essentially directed the epidemic, all the measures that were taken during the epidemic, and also corresponded with other cities in other parts of Italy. And the result is that there's an enormous correspondence which survives still in the Archivio di Stato. So they knew in advance where plague was broken out, and they would roughly therefore gauge when it might arrive in their city, having taken precautions. So that was so the health board was the overall administrator, if you like, of the policy during plague. And then there were a series of other ones which sound, incredibly familiar. So there's the contact tracing. So you have patient zero, and you've got records of actually in the Archivio di Stato of all the people who they held as being responsible in actually their house, the number of the house, where they lived, and so on. And then they traced how it spread from one house to one street to another. Again, this is sort of very familiar from what we went through a couple of years ago. A similar sort of system. And in order to do that, they had a series of sort of police officials and public health officials who, and also informal neighborhood watch, who were essentially encouraged by financial inducements to report people. So there was both an official and unofficial system of reporting people to the health boards for anybody who'd broken the law. The Italian states employed various systems of containment. These included shutting up people in their houses, which you may remember, closing off streets, closing off sections of the city, and also placing the resident population under lockdown. Regulations which were put into force included restricting the movement of the population within the city through setting curfews, closing schools, banning mass gatherings, and gradually increasing restrictions on food markets as the plague got worse. Many shops and taverns were closed, and many occupations were stopped, particularly those associated with the sale of second-hand clothes, which were seen as harboring the corrupt vapors of disease. Obviously, this led to unemployment, as in the trial of Mona Antonio di Giovanni, who'd been arrested on Piazza Strozzi on the 16th of November, 1630. The judge began by asking, "What is your occupation?" "I weave, Your Honor. I sew. In fact, I do whatever I can to survive." What were you doing yesterday evening?" I was arrested, Your Honor, yesterday evening on Piazza Strozzi because I was carrying 2 shirts to sell because I didn't have anything to eat." "Who is in your family?" "I've got 2 children, 1 male and 1 female, who are very small, and my husband, who was a second-hand clothes dealer, but now does nothing." This is just a minute extract, and I shall quote from more trial records later on. And I think they give you a sort of very personal idea of the impact of these regulations on people's lives. So here are the problems for families when the specific economic activities were banned. The health board feared corrupt vapors were spread through cloth, and although they sanctioned a limited continuance of the textile industry, they prohibited the sale of second-hand clothes because of the likelihood that they may have belonged to somebody who died of plague. This, as we've seen, however, deprived the head of household of his livelihood and therefore his family with the benefits of the major wage earner. Hence the desperate efforts of the wife to sell some shirts. Now, plague could also potentially spread through public involvement in religious activities. And at that point, contemporaries faced a fundamental problem. For if public religious activities was banned to prevent the spread of plague, it was then feared that God would prolong the epidemic in order to punish the citizens for their negligence. While churches were gradually closed as mortality increased, the clergy in some cities insisted on continuing processions on public religious festivals. But in other cities, such as Florence, processions were only reintroduced as the situation improved to express gratitude for the intervention of the Virgin Mary and patron saints. In December 1630, for example, a grand procession was organized from San Marco down to the cathedral, carrying the body of Saint Antoninus, who we saw a little earlier. It was an enormous procession and included all the members of the Grand Ducal family, leading members of the church. It arrived at the cathedral, Mass was celebrated, and then Saint Antoninus was taken back. However, there was social segregation. So in order not to prevent the spread of plague further, they allowed people to watch the procession, but not to actually join the procession. So you have this sort of lovely image of people standing on the corners of streets, sort of looking out and peering over each other in order to try and see the procession pass, and obviously be part of this expiatory health authorities across Europe employed a large group of staff to cope with the impact of plague. And these would include male doctors, physicians, and surgeons, searchers of the dead to identify the disease, and medical staff to treat the sick. Others were employed to carry the sick to quarantine centres and the dead to be buried. Functions undertaken in many cities by members of voluntary fraternities. In Florence, the Archconfraternity of the Misericordia, which still runs the ambulance service today, as you know, has an extraordinary charitable tradition going back to the 13th century. They were the ones who performed most of the ambulance service, most of the carrying of sick and dead during the epidemic in Florence in 1631. This is an image. The top is a rather schematized later print of an earlier oil painting, which is actually still in the entrance to the Misericordia today in Piazza del Duomo. But from this, you can see, and I used as you can see it, the jacket of my book. You can see the full image at the top, which shows you obviously the cathedral with its unfinished facade, the campanile, the Brunelleschi's dome behind. And then on the right-hand side, you can see the Misericordia's sede, their headquarters, which was covered with frescoes by Porchetti of the 7 works of mercy, which were the 7 works which were the inspiration for the Misericordia's role, and is indeed still today. To go to the, and so the slightly more detailed image underneath, in the color is certainly better, summarizes some of the main roles of the Misericordia. There are areas full of figures, some of which seem to be practicing social distancing, while others take part in scenes reflecting both their professional and personal reactions to the plague. Now, one of the main aims of this picture is to demonstrate the charitable work of the Misericordia, whose members you can see in both of them, these two images were dressed in black, performing their vital role in carrying plague victims to isolation hospitals or lazzaretti, which we'll come on to soon, and transporting dead to be buried in special graves for the plague victims. So I said on the right-hand side, you see the large building decorated with frescoes by Puccetti. Underneath, members stand around waiting the call to take their part. And if you've ever been into the Misericordia headquarters now, people are still are waiting around to be called to fetch somebody in an ambulance. While to the left, a small group sets out with a litter to collect the sick. The horrible noise. So this is what I'm talking about. This is the Misericordia headquarters, and it's up here. And there's a group here which is going out with a litter to pick up somebody who's sick. In the foreground, you can see the image of a patrician who's collapsed here at the bottom, dressed in blue, who's presumably sick from plague. Now he's attended by a doctor who's in red, and to the right are two members of the Misericordia in black, one of whom is pointing to the body, probably discussing best how to place him in the red covered litter behind. Behind, I don't know if you can see it, but there is another member of the Misericordia who's here, who's holding his nose, presumably to protect himself from breathing in the infected air breathed out by the sick man. On the left, at the bottom of the steps leading up to the main entrance to the cathedral, you can see that there are two priests wearing white surplices and black hats, who are following three brothers carrying a crucifix and a taper to purify the air. Also, what's interesting, I think, about this picture is, in fact, we'll see this in both of the pictures, but particularly in the bottom one, is that the personal reactions of members of the public. So in the foreground, to the left-hand side, there's a mother and a child who's here, supporting each other and watch the events in the piazza. In front of them is a man in a red hat and a woman in a white bonnet who's here, and a blue dress, who's vigorously pointing to the events before them. I mean, this is sort of very unusual to see, if you like, members of the public reacting in this way in an image like this. While in the center background, and I don't know if you can see this woman here in red, she's running towards the Misericordia here, the headquarters, because her son has run off to look through the barrier in front of the Misericordia to see what's happening. She's obviously frightened that he will get plague. So this picture provides a very vivid idea of what it's like to live through plague, reflecting both official and individual reactions to an unfolding crisis. And this is very different from other types of imagery, such as this one of the plague in Naples in 1656 by Mico Spadaro, which shows total confusion in the piazza, in the Largo Mercatello. So here instead, we have, this is perhaps a slightly better image, we have a much more orderly system, which is under the control of the government, under the control of the Misericordia. Here you can see very well the couple here pointing, the little boy and the mother here, and the woman here in the middle running towards her son, who's looking through this steccato, the barrier in front of the Misericordia. Now, obviously, these initiatives establishing these public health policies, as with COVID, implied an incredible financial investment for the Italian governments. not just in money, but also in personnel, justified by contemporary belief in the efficacy based on their understanding. Eliminate the fomites of plague, or the corrupt vapors of plague, which were seen as sticking to the material and objects. And here we've got an image of sort of rather satirical image in Rome in 1656 of the officials of the Sanità going into a house where plague has broken out and basically throwing everything out, including guitars, you can see, down to the bottom, either to be burned or to be disinfected. So at that point, objects were taken, once a house was locked up, objects were taken out, linen and cloth and clothes were taken out and disinfected, and then later on returned or not returned, depending on the situation. Now, despite all these regulations, by December 1630, the authorities in Florence were becoming impatient that while mortality was declining and had not yet disappeared, they therefore took the unusual step to adopt a new policy, which was to lock down, familiar word, the whole population for 40 days from 20th of January 1631, which was incidentally the feast day of Saint Sebastian, patron saint of plague and patron saint of the Misericordia. This argument proved persuasive, and when the general quarantine was imposed, it was noted it did have the effect of restricting the movement of the population. For only one adult member of each household was allowed to go out in order to collect food each day. But remarkably, the government provided food and drink on a daily basis for the 34,000 people who were locked up. And they had probably a much better menu than their normal one, because they had apparently they had bread, wine, supplemented by fish, meat, and salad. And this, as I say, was provided free to them over the period of 40 days. Ostensibly, this measure of lockdown did work because the mortality actually began to fall. But it wasn't just infected objects removed from houses in Italy, but also sick individuals were taken off to be quarantined. And then this leads to our third strand of government policy. Like the large isolation centres created in the UK, the so-called Nightingale hospitals, lazzaretti or isolation hospitals formed an essential element of quarantine. What distinguished isolation hospitals in Renaissance Italy was their size and their scale, and the fact that they were mostly built of brick or stone. Very different, for example, from those on a much smaller scale in England in this period. There was, however, considerable variation in the types of buildings which were used. So many cities, as we'll see in Florence, simply took over existing palaces, villas, convents, monasteries, and so on. But some cities built their own. And here we have an example of perhaps the largest one, which was created in Italy in this period, in Milan in the late 15th century. This was an enormous square, as you can see, of about 370 square meters. And by the 17th century, during the 1630 epidemic, it came to house about 16,000 people. Just imagine what that would have been like. It was, all those people who read Promessi Sposi, the Betrothed by Manzoni, remember there's a very memorable evocation, although he's writing much later, very memorable evocation of what it was like walking through this enormous square with a sort of temporary huts and sheds and tents which were put up, housing these thousands and thousands of people. There was an earlier lazzaretto in Venice, which was established in the earlier 15th century, called the Lazzaretto Vecchio. Venice was fortunate that it had almost a lagoon, and the Sanità in Venice took over two islands. One became known as the Lazzaretto Vecchio, to which plague victims were taken. And then there was also a Lazzaretto Nuovo, to which people were taken when they were either better, not everybody died in Lazzaretti, you'll be surprised to know, and also people who come into contact in the city with plague victims. So in other words, people would be in the Lazzaretto Vecchio for however long it took them to recover, and then they'd spend 40 days in quarantine, 40, in the Lazzaretto Nuovo, and then they were allowed to return home. So there was this sort of well worked out system, if you like, of people were taken from their houses by boat, obviously in this case, or by cart in Florence, off to the Vecchio, and then they died or improved, taken to the quarantine and allowed home. In 1575, just to give you some idea of the scale, I don't want to give you too many figures, which was one of the worst epidemics in Venice. These two Lazzaretti, island Lazzaretti, proved insufficient. And so they requisitioned about 3,000 boats, which were then moored off the island, which catered for another 8,000 to 10,000 people. So just think of the scale of this operation and the expense, obviously, of running it all as well. So let's get now back to Florence. In the case of Florence, during the last epidemic of plague to affect the city, 1630 to 1, existing ecclesiastical and secular buildings were adapted as isolation and quarantine centres for those sick and those who'd recovered. They were cited, and here's a map essentially of all the main quarantine centres and lazzaretti in use during the plague of 1630 to 31. The largest one, and they were all, as you'll see, outside the city centre, although the first lazzaretto was actually in the hospital of Messer Bonifacio in Via San Gallo, which is now, you may know, the Questura. And that was soon abandoned when it was realized it wasn't a very good idea to have a lazzaretto in the center of the city because it would work as a sort of pool of infection, if you like. And then it was abandoned, and then these large ones were established on the outskirts of the city. The largest of all, and you may be surprised when you next go there, remember this, was San Miniato al Monte, which was requisitioned. The church was requisitioned and it became a major hospital. You can, if you imagine what, I mean, it's tended by friars and tended by by doctors and surgeons. So San Miniato was taken over, and also as the epidemic got worse, because that was for men and women, as the epidemic got worse, they then took over the contiguous church of San Francesco, which is just, as you know, to the left, which one was for men and one was for women. And then on the other side of Florence, there was what is now the European University, or the Badia Fiessolana, became the major lazzaretto for Florence to the north. And then in addition to all that, there were a whole series of small villas taken over by Badia Ripoli, Pian Giulari, Bellosguardo, where I happen to be staying at the moment, San Domenico, Ciompo, and so on and so forth to the north. So in other words, Florence was circled by these lazzaretti to which people were taken by the Misericordia. However, as in the case of in Venice, just as Venice had a Lazzaretto Nuovo and a Lazzaretto Vecchio, in the case of Florence, they also had a quarantine center where people were taken once they got better. And this, you may know, just off Via Fortini is the enormous villa of Villa Rosciano, which was taken over as a quarantine center, as I say. The Grand Duke, Ferdinand, the young Ferdinand II, was very active in this period, and it was he essentially who was behind a lot of these measures. So, for example, in San Miniato, he donated the area of the Fortezza di San Miniato as well to look after the plague victims. Contemporaries who wrote official accounts of physicians or physicians writing medical treatises to advise the health board would have presented an optimistic view of how the Lazzaretti functioned and how they contributed to the city's fight against the epidemic. There are vivid scenes, there are vivid descriptions of what it was actually like to be treated and to work within the Lazzaretto from an almost daily correspondence which still survives between the director of the Lazzaretto of San Miniato and the health board. And it describes the incredibly crowded beds with 5 or 6 people a bed, the problems of burying large numbers of people in sort of shallow graves, the problems of the doctors and the surgeons who were employed there getting ill themselves. But what I think is remarkable as well is that one gets the impression of an extraordinary compassion which emerges from his descriptions, but also the records of the physicians and surgeons who worked there. I mean, they were doing it, physicians and surgeons were paid, but therefore you could say they were bribed, but it was also, I think, certainly out of Christian charity, which also obviously informed the Frati Cappuccini, the Capuchin friars, who directed it and also provided nursing staff and also spiritual care as well. Having said that, the death rate at the Lazzaretto in Florence over this year was something like 55%. So over half the people who entered died. That raises the question, why didn't everybody die? But maybe we can talk about that later on. So far then, I've discussed the 3 main features of plague public health adopted by European states, and Italy in particular. All of these are familiar, at least in outline, to the measures that were put into place during our plague epidemic of COVID. Another feature which has struck us all over the last few years has been the way that people coped with the epidemic and once restrictions were put into place. Today, this is reflected in numerous news channels, social media. However, back in the 17th century, to state the obvious, these means of communication were not available, perhaps just as well. So how do historians attempt to recreate the experience of what it was to live through an epidemic in the past, from the perspective, if you like, of the people, the low levels of society? One way is through looking at diaries and letters when they've survived, and obviously these reflect the more literate classes' reactions. But what about the poorer? One way is by examining court records of those prosecuted for breaking plague legislation. And this forms an important theme of my book, which I'll talk about in this final section. And what remains, I think, fascinating to me, I mean, as I say, I finished the book, it was published before COVID began. But on returning to the section of the book, I have a chapter about plague trials. During and after COVID, I found many fascinating parallels between the reactions of people in the past and in the present. Now, I was fortunate that I managed to track down something like 550 trials for people prosecuted for one reason or another during periods of plague and arrested, and the trials and the records remain in the Archivio di Stato. And they give you a very good idea of how people did react. There are a series of reasons people were brought to trial, but most reflect the desire by individuals to attempt to continue a fairly normal way of life, even during plague, and to either protect or acquire possessions, either their own or somebody else's, when a house had been left locked up. Most of those arrested had left their houses, which were associated with sickness, death, or then others who'd left their houses during quarantine in order to, they were in the street after curfew, or quite often they went to visit friends. There are lots of very short, pithy little descriptions of what it was like to live through plague. So one of these people who was arrested was a widow called Sandra di Matteo. who was arrested on the 23rd of July, the day after the beginning of the quarantine. And she said, I was arrested because I left the house, because I heard the clacking of a hen. And when I returned inside, I was arrested and was taken off to prison. So, I mean, this is curious. It's just a couple of lines in this court record. But this woman lived run out. And at the point the chicken had run out, somebody from the health board passed and found her in the street and said, what the hell are you doing here? She was arrested and taken off. But you'll be pleased to know her testimony was so innocent that she was just allowed to go home again. But it also might involve hiding disease through not declaring somebody had died of malcontagiosa, the contagious sickness, as in the case of the fishmonger Giovanni di Bruno Brunelli, who was arrested on the 4th of November. He had carried, apparently, according to the records, with the help of another man, furtively and at night, the body of his grandson who died of plague in Via delle Rote to his own house in Via San Zenobi. He claimed he'd done so that those people who lived in the house where the child had died wouldn't be locked up. However, he had compounded his crime because, quote, the said Giovanni had gone on to mix with a number of people, and particularly in selling fish in the Mercato Vecchio, where he could supposedly infect the whole of Florence. Now, although no more details are provided, presumably his motivation had been to support his own children so that his son could continue to work, though clearly he hadn't thought through the implications of then infecting the rest of the city, if indeed this was a consideration for him. So the Mercato Vecchio was also not just the place to sell food, buy food, but also the place where punishments were administered. You probably know from the column in the middle of the Mercato. And one of the punishments which was administered, and this was actually a really small percentage of people punished in this way, was the so-called strappado. I don't know if you've come across this before, but it's the most unpleasant form of torture which was often used by the Inquisition. And it involved putting rope around somebody's arms and then hauling them up and then dropping them. So when they fell to the ground, their shoulders and their arms would probably be broken. So that was for some of the more, if you like, heinous crimes during the epidemic. Surprisingly enough, only one person was actually executed. It was right at the beginning of the epidemic, compared with some other cities such as Milan. You remember from your the descriptions in the Promessi Sposi of the Untori who spread plague. They were most of them were executed. One person only was executed in Florence. And I think what struck me when I was looking at the records of the punishments which were administered to these people was actually how relatively mild they were on the whole. So again, I sort of come back, if you like, this theme of compassion, that the judge would have somebody haul up in front of them, have their testimony, and say, well, look, you've suffered enough, 2 days in this hellhole of a very crowded prison, you can go home now. So something like 70% of people who were arrested were actually let off very, very, very quickly. Now, although no more details provided, presumably the motivation of this man had been to support his own children so that his son could continue to work. There were also a surprising number of people who were found, not just, as I mentioned before, arrested by the health board officers, but also they were reported by so-called amici segreti, so neighbors who looked out of their windows and discovered their neighbors doing something they shouldn't have done. I mean, you know, anybody who knows about witch trials, it's a similar sort of thing, that old enmities between neighbors are then translated, if you like, into the reporting of people to the police. Some people were accused of stealing from empty houses, There were even accusations against health board doctors who'd been bribed to provide a misdiagnosis, so that the sick person, especially the more affluent, could avoid going to the lazaretto, or if dead, burial in the anonymous plague pit or campo. Once the plague had really taken over in November, December, there was a rise in the number of people causing offences by moving around the street and breaking out of locked houses. This was a pattern which increased dramatically during the total quarantine of the city. And here's an example of somebody who broke out through sheer frustration or financial hardship, being shut up in a cramped apartment with their families, or even being shut up alone. And there's a case of Lucrezia di Francesco Bianchi on the 22nd of January, 1631, who gave the following testimony. I live in Via del Campaccio in Ognissanti, and about a month ago, I returned to the house of Lorenzo the Miller in Via della Selvia in order to not to have to remain alone in my house during the quarantine. Remember what that was like. I returned to Via del Campaccio, as I said, but because I didn't know anybody there and didn't want to remain alone, I went to stay in this house of the miller's wife, who is my friend. So this rather sort of repetitive testimony suggests that actually these were the words that she spoke. Now, when the miller's wife, her friend, was interviewed, it emerged that there was actually more to the story, because Lucrezia had no ordinary profession. She worked as a prostitute and was registered in the health board's registers as living in Via del Campaccio. To cover herself, the miller's wife provides a very human story for why she'd allowed Lucrezia to live with her. Lucrezia has employed me many times to allow her to return. And above all, she's my very close friend. So this case speaks both to solitude, which is not something that's often recorded in official documents, and boredom, the interruption of normal economic activity, the fear of moral pollution, and also of these informal networks of sociability and affection between individuals, which proves stronger than fear of the law. This is a theme which is repeated over and over again in these records, which reflect the close proximity of which families lived and the bonds which bound together members to provide support for the sick and the dying, even in face of state regulation and fear of their own fate. A surprising number of people were also caught in the street talking to people in locked up houses. On the 7th of October, for example, Antonio di Francesco Trapalesi gives the following testimony. Last Wednesday, I was walking towards Porto La Croce, and when I was close to the gate, a woman called Mona Maria, who was locked in her house by the health board, called out of the window and said, "Come stai, caro? How are you?" I said to her that I was which Mona Maria talked was on the ground floor. But then he said, I was standing on that side of the street, so I shouldn't have infected anybody. So this is an example of Mona Maria, who could potentially infect an acquaintance, since if she was sick, could have breathed out infected air. However, evidently, since he was some distance away, this was not regarded as a risk, and he was released after questioning. So to my final case. Even during the quarantine, health board regulations of the city don't appear to have prevented social activity. There are examples of people climbing over roofs to visit friends, carousing together on balconies and on rooftops to while away the time. In January 1631, 3 men, for example, Matteo d'Andrea Zaccagnini, Giovanni di Nicolo Fogliari, and Giovanni Sarto, the tailor, were all arrested in Via San Gallo because, quote, each day they climbed over 2 roofs and the terrace belonging to Beto Iudico. And with the said Salvestro and his sons, they played cards. However, worse was to come. On the 22nd of January, they broke down the entrance of the flat, which had been locked up because people inside had plague, belonging to 2 prostitutes, Maria di Menico and Benedetta di Francesco, where they were discovered and then taken off to jail. When interviewed, as you might imagine, the protagonists closed ranks For example, Benedetta, when she questioned, said, "I don't know how to play the guitar." And I didn't hold a guitar on the roof, even though I was on the roof. And Matteo and the man called Giovanni were on their own roofs, not with anybody else. I didn't see anybody on Better Judico's roof either. So in this case, these people were initially following the regulations of health board, for as they're instructed during the quarantine, they were allowed to take air on their roofs or on their balconies, permitted by the health board during the quarantine in order to get away from the sort of stuffy environment in which they lived. However, obviously, by climbing along roofs and mixing with other people, they were breaking the quarantine, which had been imposed to prevent people mixing together, exacerbated obviously still further when they broke down the bar, which had been put up the health board, to the flat belonging to Benedetta and Maria. The protagonists were fined and punished for leaving a locked up house, but their occupations compounded their felony. But moral pollution in this case was added to the corruption caused by plague. I could give you many more examples, but I know the time has come when you'll eventually go off your wine. So it seems to me I will draw, which I'm told is very good, so I'm looking forward to that too. I will conclude. So these extracts from trial records, I think, point to a complex interaction between authority and residents. They raise the whole question about how far rules and regulations were really put into effect. Because obviously, even though I unearthed 550 trial records, how many other people were breaking the law had been discovered. But I think the picture as well of a confrontation of authority and subject is too black and white to reflect the complexity of social life and individual reactions to plague. The incidents I've described here derived both from individuals being apprehended by the health board and also being reported by neighbours. Awareness of the dangers of plague spreading and infection was not simply confined to the magistrates, therefore. It was also widespread among the populace, for there were many instances of neighbours reporting each other. So in the talk, I've outlined some of the main elements of plague policy in early modern Italian cities. These coincided with the contemporary categories during COVID of containment, mitigation, and quarantine, from cordon sanitaire to household isolation and even lockdown. Contemporaries emphasized the central role of isolation and quarantine, especially the role and efficacy of the lazzaretto, which was regarded in many parts of Europe as a vital part in their strategy in fighting plague. It was, though, a very expensive operation, which then had to be publicly justified by statistics produced by the health board and obviously by medical theory, which saw the locking up and the removal of the sick as vital to prevent them infecting their neighbours with their infected breath. Many of these themes we've seen reflected in recent years as governments sought to battle against our plague, balancing restrictions with the impact on the economy, leading to debates about individual freedom or the social control for the good of society. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, John. That was absolutely fascinating. And not least because so little has changed in 400 years. The parallels between what was going on in the 17th century and what we all experienced a couple of years ago are really striking. It's,
very extraordinary.
Even though we now understand a little bit more about where the plague's coming from, yes. They, for the wrong reasons, were actually using the right strategies. It's kind of interesting stuff. Okay, as always, we now do move to the question and answer session. Usual rules. If you're in the room and want to make a point, I'll bring you the microphone so that people on the Zoom can hear us. Hello, Zoomers. And if you're on the Zoom, put something on the chat and I'll read it out on your behalf. The chat is now open again. And if you're feeling brave and want to talk to us, you just unmute and we'll hear you in the room. So does anyone want to go first? We've got somebody at the back.
First of all, I want to thank you on behalf of everybody that's here. We survived COVID.
Well done.
But I wanted to ask you about the most important impact of the Great Plague of Milan, the economic impact. Venice never recovered as a power after that plague, nor did Northern Italy. Isn't that true?
Yes, it is true. I mean, some of the industries obviously went on. I mean, there's the old chestnut that the Italian economy was in decline in this period. I think that's been somewhat overturned. But in the case of Florence, which is interesting, is that certainly it was in decline. At some point, they actually opened them up again. But certainly the Florentine economy, like other ones, didn't. Certainly the Florentine company never really did recover after that. Even though during the epidemic, the Grand Duke, for example, did implement sort of work strategies so that he employed people for digging the gardens at Palazzo Pitti, for example, and doing other sort of good works in the city, and which kept people above the bread line, if you like, during the epidemic. But then afterwards, people led to enormous unemployment. Yeah, certainly.
Thank you. A follow-on question to that. How were the Lazarettis and the doctors and all this other stuff paid? What paid? How is it afforded by the city? And sort of a follow-on, how much would have been donated, for example, by the princes or by the Misericordia, just out of goodwill? And how much would actually have been, how much would it have cost? I mean, how did they finance it?
Sure, I could give you a lot of boring figures, but I won't. So in broad terms, Florence, I think, was fortunate to have the young Grand Duke Ferdinand just come to power. So he was full of enthusiasm. He was full of enthusiasm to prove to himself, to Florence, that he was part of the sort of long tradition of Medici charity. And so he helped finance for example, the quarantine during the spring of 1631. As I said, he also implemented various sort of work schemes as well, which kept some people employed. But it was obviously, as you say, phenomenally expensive and they raised money through subscription, actually. So it was members of I mean, there are lists of the sort of amount of money that all the members of the princes and the different members of the Grand Ducal court supplied. The nobles as well were the sort of noble families were also sort of part of that scheme of raising cash. And I think one of the remarkable things is that going through the records is that a lot of the administrative staff, for example, who did the sort of very beginning of the epidemic, there was a very detailed environmental survey of the city where they went through each house looking to see the number of mattresses that looked diseased and needed replacing, or leaking cesspits, because they realized at the time there was a connection between the sort of environment and disease. And the people who undertook those surveys were in fact often a member of the patrician families. And they write very moving accounts of what it was like. I mean, obviously they'd passed these houses by but not actually been in them before. So very moving accounts of what conditions were people living in. So there was an enormous amount of voluntary, I mean, as you know, as there still is too. I mean, the charitable services that are on today, Misericordia is obviously charitable too. Everybody who worked in Misericordia, at least all the fratelli were voluntary. The doctors were paid for by the health board, and the money then came out of various large sort of government funds. I mean, for example, the Monte di Pietà, the sort of government, the sort of loan bank for the poor was raided. Taxes were raised as well, and obviously taxes had to continue to be raised after the end of the epidemic too. So there were lots of different ways that they sort of managed to support it. But the Grand Duke did actually spend an absolute fortune. I mean, that comes out of very laudatory biographies of him at the time, so it may be slightly exaggerated. But what is remarkable is going through the financial records of the government in this period, you can actually work out what all the different measures actually cost, and also how it was all supported. So I think it was a remarkable, quite a remarkable policy and sort of effort by the Tuscan state, and this was extended to the rest of Grand Ducal Tuscany, so that all these measures were implemented in all the towns in the Contado and so on, and they had their own Magistrato di Sanità as well, who then reported back to this Magistrato di Sanità in the city. And again, money was raised through taxes. Surveys once again were conducted by often patricians who went out into the countryside to look at conditions of the poor, because obviously it was the idea that insanitary conditions bred plague, so that had to be addressed. But also there was the idea that if somebody ate badly, that would also corrupt their sort of humours, which is how their body was made up. And the humours would then become corrupted and they breathe out infected air. So the poor were obviously blamed for the plague as well, because of the food they ate and poor way of life.
Interesting. And nice to see people on the Zoom. Harry, hello, and Christine, I can see you.
I've got a question.
Harry, come on, speak to us.
So I wondered if there was a record of how many people got the plague and then recovered, because I once saw the most fascinating program. It could have been Panorama, and in a nutshell, it was an American guy in the 80s. All his friends died of AIDS and he never got it. And he managed to trace his ancestry back to Eyam in Derbyshire, where they thought that's where the Black Death started. And he was descended from the genetics, I think it was called ERAP2 gene, ERAP2. Anyway, his descendants had that gene and never got the plague. And they think that's why he didn't get AIDS. And it was just absolutely fascinating. If you can find it, it was brilliant. But I just wondered if there were records of who got plague and if they recovered, how many.
It's very difficult to say. It depends what you mean by recovered as well, I suppose, as with any disease. So what we have are these records, people who are admitted to the Lazzaretto. All these records are actually in the Misericordia. It's extraordinary, lists and lists of people's names. We've also got lists of the people who came out of the Lazzaretto alive or went to the quarantine center of Villa Rosciano. And some, as I think I mentioned before, 52% of people who went into the Lazzaretto died, which means that 48% didn't. So was then, the records are not good enough to know, whether they actually had plague, because I mean, contemporaries complained about the fact that people who looked vaguely ill, who sort of just coughed, were and I've never quite worked out why this should have been the case, why only, inverted commas, 12% of the Florentine population died. Which suggests, Florence hadn't experienced plague for about 100 years. The last time plague hit Florence was in the 1520s. It hadn't recurred in the late 16th century, where it had in other parts of northern Italy. So this 48% who got better, I suppose either, as I say, had another disease, or they genuinely did get better. And there are records, descriptions in the Lazzaretto of doctors, or the surgeons lancing the buboes and allowing the matter to be come out. And they said that actually was a good way of curing, and that did actually work. Again, the problem is you can't, these are just stray comments in correspondence or the journals of diaries of the doctors. So they don't actually have a list of people. Giovanni di Tommaso came in on the 2nd of September 1630, and he had plague. He was put in such and such a bed. He got better after 30 days. He was sent off to Rusciano. and then he went home. And we just don't have those sort of records. But there is the whole question, which you raised, which again, I think is very difficult to prove, but it's an interesting theory, is the extent to which people could build up immunity. And I mean, there is Samuel Cohn, whose work you may know, who's worked on plague from the 14th century onwards. He maintains that the plague, there was the 1348 plague, 1348 to 9 plague, then it came back in 1363. And he maintains that so those people who, one of his theories is that those people who survived the 1348 plague had some immunity in the 1340, in 1363. Other people have posited that for other periods and other places. Again, without, the problem is what is plague, and the other problem is, how good was diagnosis? So it's a very quite fascinating and sort of area of debate, and people, there've been other people who suggested it wasn't bubonic plague at all, that it was some other disease, or that there were different diseases at the same time. So, in other words, the epidemic of plague in 1631 in Florence, 1331 in Florence, there was high mortality from plague. But if you look at parish registers, you discover there was also high mortality in that period. The significance of that is that anybody who was sick from plague was whisked off the lazzaretto. Anybody who didn't have plague would have been buried in the parish. So in theory, the numbers of people shouldn't have gone up as much as they did in the parish burials. So alas, I mean, it's obviously there are lots of statistics, but even now, death records are not that accurate either. People have multiple causes of death. So alas, it's a fascinating subject, but it's very difficult to finally pin it down.
Fan message from Antonio. Congratulations, John. I hope our paths cross again.
Oh, I know. She's my PhD student.
Right, there you go. And Sarah's put up on the chat for the Zoomers a polite reminder that if you feel like making a donation for your participation, please feel free to do so. There's a link to our site there. We'd like having you with us, but it's great to have a little bit of a contribution as well. So, any more in the room? We got any more? Actually, lots more. Oh, okay, but we'll go here and then behind you.
I'm just curious if the lazzaretti here in Florence were farther outside of the city, especially compared to Milan and Venice, and if so, if transportation posed a problem ever.
I think they were no further out than elsewhere. I mean, if you think of the lagoon, quite a long way away, and obviously transportation there was by boat. So it was the Misericordia, of course, who carried them, and they had these cataletti, some of which still survived, and which people, I should have shown you an example, which people were carried. And if you think, I mean, next time you walk up to Miniato, you know how. So essentially, people they would arrive at the Porta di San Miniato, just outside, on the way up to San Miniato. The Misericordia would leave them there, and then there would be people who came from the Lazzaretto, from San Miniato itself, who then came and collected them on the last sort of really backbreaking. And you can imagine these capelletti full of sort of heavy, and what it must be like in sort of bumpy ride as well. Walking. So I don't think the Florentine ones were any further away. Normally, they were established outside the city walls, quite as far as they possibly could be. And in the 15th century, they hadn't really established a lazarette until the 1490s, and people were taken to Santa Minuova, right in the center of Florence. Then they began realizing at a certain point it probably wasn't a good idea to have plague victims in the center. But I think it's probably, the one in Milan was well outside the center, unless that lazzaretto was demolished in the late 19th century, because it would have been an amazing place to visit. But I believe that if you noticed in the design I showed you, there was actually a chapel right in the center, which was a round open chapel. And that still does survive. So bits of it survive, which is interesting.
Thank you very much for that marvelous talk. Very interesting perspective on this fascinating subject. I think we're all struck by the parallels that you drew between COVID treatments or policies and those which were enacted in the plague in Florence. There's another set of parallels that may also be developed. You may remember that a politician in the United States suggested drinking bleach to curtail the infection. And I think that in every case, whether it's the plague of 1918 influenza or leprosy, there have been policies put in place, either formal or informal, that were not very beneficial. In fact, might have been quite the opposite. And even thinking about the isolation that you described, it really is not going to be effective against rats. They're going to be able to move from house to house without any difficulty whatsoever. So is it possible to talk about what
well, it's difficult to know what was beneficial. You're right, in a way. I mean, the medical treatment, at the time, they said the lancing of buboes was effective. I mean, according to their ideas, what they were doing was effective. So one of the main treatments, which you may know about, was theriac or mithridatum. Theriac was a combination, sort of compound medicine. One of its main ingredients was the poison from scorpions' tails and from adders' tails. The idea, I mean, if you like, with Chinese medicine is treating the opposite with opposites. So the poison of the scorpion or the adder would treat the poison, the venomous poison within the body. I think if one tested it now, I suspect theriac wouldn't be regarded as very efficacious. I think what I've been trying to do in the book and also today as well, is to try and understand what they were doing within the context of what they thought and what they believed, rather than thinking, if you like, from the present day and sort of reading it back. But I think there is a wider question which historians still need to address, which is that all these public health measures, which everybody said were fantastic in the Renaissance Italy, which were copied in different parts of Europe, like, or not copied or whatever, which they all said was efficacious, like the lacerate. As you say, was it actually effective? I mean, was it effective to shove all these people with plague together with their nice flea-ridden clothes, or would that actually make it worse? Whereas in countries to the north of Europe, I mean, for example, in England, they had very limited lacereti, and they seem to have had a lower mortality rate. Now, why one area has a higher or lower mortality rate is something we could talk about for the rest of the evening. Thousands of factors which sort of make that, and it's almost impossible at this distance really to ascertain it. So I think my point of view is, okay, I mean, if I was being cynical, I'd say, well, very few of these things would actually work. But on the other hand, I think it's a massive, it was a sort of massive series of measures and policies which demonstrated the government was doing something about it, which is, after all governments have to justify themselves to their population, don't they? And that was the sort of basis behind it. And within their own beliefs and within their ideas, they were right.
Okay.
Your last remarks, thank you very much, brilliant lecture. Your last remarks remind me of the fact though that I think the Venetian lazaretti and the Florentine lazaretti did seem to have had the effect of reducing plague in northern Italy, in comparison to England, obviously, where the Great Plague of London was 1665. I wonder if you had any comments about the relative philanthropical side of the sufferings in those periods between Protestant cultures and Catholic cultures.
Ah, it sounds familiar, Edward.
Yeah.
Old sparring partners used to.
As you know, but maybe other people that know that the English travellers, very reluctant to praise anything Catholic because most of them were Protestant, couldn't help admiring the Italian hospitals in the 17th century.
Absolutely, you're quite right. So in broad terms, I suppose, if one compares, say, England and Italy in the 17th century and measures that were taken by both, what is interesting, I think, is that the English Privy Council, at least in the late 16th century, admired the measures that were taken in Italy. So, for example, Queen Elizabeth's doctor, Cesare Adelmari, who came from Padua originally, sent off to his chums in Padua and asked for a copy of the plague regulations that were in place in northern Italy. He brought them back, discussed in the Privy Council. Wow, it's fantastic. We must have a health board. We must have lazzaretti, etc., etc. But what is fascinating is that none of these things were actually put into operation because of the system of government. So there was enormous, I mean, there were lazzaretti, but they were on a very small scale, Tothill fields and so on in England, but they were on a very small scale. So people were shut up in their houses rather than put into lazzaretti. They didn't have an overall health board either. And this obviously has got to do with the system of difference between the systems of governments, between Italian city-states or princely states and the, oh, sorry. So embarrassing. Please turn off your mobile before you speak. So obviously the system of government in London was very different, run at the ward level, which is where they raised the money. And therefore they probably couldn't afford to pay for lazzaretto on the scale which the Italian states would have paid. However, what is interesting, if you compare mortality during these epidemics in the 17th century Italy, it's actually higher than England in the same period. So that raises the whole question, was these measures that were taken in Italy, in fact, detrimental? Whereas in Italy, England, everybody was shut up in the houses. I mean, this is an enormous question, and I think you need a large research project to really answer it properly. But you're right. I mean, essentially, these lazzaretti were also based on the long tradition of charity of large hospitals, which were, certainly in the Renaissance, larger than anywhere else in Europe. And so they had experience of running substantial institutions and treating a large number of the sick.
Quick one, yeah, because you're running out of time.
You don't think the reason had anything to do with Henry VIII shutting down all the monastic hospitals?
Yeah, but they weren't. Well, no, actually, because, I mean, none of them were on an enormous scale anyway. They weren't on the scale of Italian hospitals. And anyhow, the major London ones were refounded in the later 16th century, weren't they? And they, somewhere like Thomas's and Bart's and so on, were refounded and got larger and larger, almost on the scale of Italian ones by the 17th century.
I think we're now out of time. Unless there's anyone who's got something desperately that they have to say on the Zoom. No, they've all gone to sleep. No, not gone to sleep. That's wrong. Sorry. Bad me. Naughty.
No.
No, they've just been listening intently. Haven't had time to type. That's what they do. Yeah. Sorry. So we've now got to stage of the evening when I'm going to invite you all to come for a glass of wine in the other room from our seasoned partners, Rufino. It's good.
Can we?
Huge thanks to John Henderson for finding Debbie on our stage. It's always a great pleasure listening to somebody who really knows very deep. So thank you. Okay, wine time.